Stout.
Thank you, my lady. The first witness this morning is Mr. Chris Sterling. May he please be sworn.
Please repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Sterling. Could you please give the court your full name?
Christopher Andrew Sterling.
Thank you. You very helpfully provided the inquiry with a witness statement, the reference for which is INQ 000561670. It's 41 pages long and dated the 29th of January 2025. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you very much. Just by way of professional background, and before we get to your roles and responsibilities during the pandemic, you say that by profession you're a project manager and programme manager, is that right?
It is.
Over the last 15 years you have led some major government programmes.
Yes.
Prior to the pandemic that included in roles at director level at the Ministry of Justice and through 2019 at the Department for Health and Social Care.
That's correct.
Two of your previous roles have what you call connections to the broader preparedness agenda, and those are that in 2014 you supported Public Health England around the National Pandemic Flu Service.
Correct.
And in 2015-16 you led the design of the future and now current operating model for NHS supply chain, which included things like supply chain resilience and inventory management. Is that correct?
It is.
During the pandemic, you played two, you say, related and overlapping roles, which are of relevance to this, the procurement module. And they are, firstly, that from March 2020 to September 2021, you were Programme Director of the joint DHSC and NHS England COVID, oxygen, ventilation, devices and clinical consumables response. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And from April 2021 to October of 2022, you were Interim Director of Medical Technology for DHSC.
That's correct.
So very relevant to the parts of the scope of this inquiry I'm going to be asking you about. Just to complete the picture, is it correct that you no longer work at DHSC?
That's correct.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sterling, in your very helpful witness statement, you provide, and I'm going to just look at it briefly, a flavour of the procurement landscape of medical devices like ventilators prior to the pandemic. You say that at the time, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, MHRA, had approximately 2 million pieces of medical technology licensed for use in the UK market, of which you say it was crudely estimated that around 100,000 are in regular use within the NHS every year. Is that right?
That's correct.
And as we've already heard, in the pre-pandemic environment, it was the role of NHS supply chain to support trusts to source those items effectively. Is that right?
That's correct.
Moving into the pandemic, again, just to give us a flavour of what happened, you say at the start of the pandemic, issues started to be experienced with suppliers being unable to fulfil demand and trusts being unable to source the required volumes of those pieces of kit through the usual channels. Is that right?
That's correct.
You say that led to early small-scale examples of trusts panic buying, hoarding, and of instances of competition between trusts which drove up prices. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you say that while those were initially small, there was an expectation that things would get significantly worse as stock positions and the global trade landscape, as you put it, deteriorated. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, in clear terms in your statement, you say it appeared that the existing NHS structures, both locally and nationally, would not be able to cope effectively and that an enhanced national level intervention was required. Is that right?
Correct.
And what was the response to that then?
The response from the department was to create a number of parallel streams of activity, of which the oxygen, ventilation, consumables response that I led was one of those streams.
Thank you. I think that was on the 3rd of March 2020 that became active. Is that right?
Correct.
and the scope of that programme, in terms of the key products, we're talking, aren't we, about ventilators and associated capital equipment, clinical consumables and oxygen. Is that right?
That's correct. Initially, the scope was purely ventilators,
Yep.
but that grew over time to encompass all the things you've just mentioned.
Thank you. I want to ask you first, please, in relation to that programme, the programme that you led, some questions about how targets were set and about how the scale of the requirements of these key products was understood. First, in your statement, you say that it was not the responsibility of the programme you led to actually estimate likely COVID inpatient numbers. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so what was it that your programme was responsible for estimating?
So my programme was responsible for taking the demand estimate of COVID cases and converting that effectively to a bill of materials that would be required to enable an intensive care unit to operate.
What you say in your statement about that is that there was significant uncertainty around trying to get to that number and that bill of materials. Is that right?
There is. I think there was significant uncertainty both around what the number was and therefore what the bill of materials would be, but also in the early days, significant uncertainty about the treatment patterns and pathways that would be most effective, and therefore what materials were required for each patient, regardless of the number of cases.
If I may say, Mr. Sterling, some of the figures you give in your statement are quite stark in terms of the requirements estimates. You say that between the 12th of February and the 17th of March of 2020, the requirements estimates vary between 59,000, 90,000 and 138,000 ventilator beds. That's quite on paper, it's quite a significant variation, isn't it?
Indeed it is.
Now, we've already heard in evidence, the inquiry's heard from Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams, that there was, at the outset of the pandemic, no central list of how many ventilators were held by the NHS, what model, spec, whether they were functioning, things like that. That's right, is it?
That's correct. One of the very first things that NHS England launched prior to my involvement was a survey of the ventilator estate, which returned the results on the 6th of March.
Sir Gareth, in his evidence, told us that there were tentative estimates by DHSC and NHS England that the NHS could have access to something like 6,000 to 8,000 ventilators. But looking at the numbers you were being communicated to you, clearly again, demand for ventilated beds and the associated kit was looking likely to significantly outstrip supply.
Yes.
I want to ask you about this because something you specifically note in your witness statement, and I'm just going to read paragraph 39 and then ask you a question about it, if I may. And that's about these requirements estimates. You say, whilst they've been subsequently published, distribution of official estimates at the time was highly restricted, even within the health system. Whilst the conclusions of these analyses were shared, typically verbally, the supporting information and analysis was not. This, coupled with the uncertainties surrounding speed of pandemic progression and efficacy of potential interventions, created a highly uncertain target-setting environment. What can you tell us about the reason for the restrictions on estimates?
I believe the restriction on estimates were primarily designed to reduce circulation and avoid some of those estimates reaching the public domain and causing panic.
What might be surprising, Mr. Sterling, is that they were restricted even to somebody in your position. You're doing your best at that very early stage to get from estimates to, as you say, bill of materials. Why were they even restricted to somebody in your position? Do you know?
I think people were very happy to share the conclusions of those activities, and that was sufficient to enable me in my role to pursue all avenues available to increase the ventilation capacity in the country. But I think the desire was to reduce circulation, even amongst individuals such as myself, so that the prospects of any communication would be centrally managed.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not following. What do you mean by restriction on estimates?
So I was shared the conclusion of the numbers, So the numbers that you've just read out, people would tell me we estimate that they are 59, 79, 138. I was not able to see the documents that led to those conclusions. And so I was working from the headline conclusions rather than seeing and having access to the supporting information that had created them.
So the rationale was restricted.
So
Distribution of the rationale was restricted.
the logic and the modelling that had created those estimates was not available.
Right. And to be clear, we're talking here about estimates of the number of ventilated beds. So your job, how are we going to get from what we've got to what we might need? I just wanted to check with you whether there was any sort of hindrance to your work upon these restrictions on estimates. We'll understand that panic is and restriction is...
Surprisingly, I don't believe that impeded our response, because the numbers were all so large that they required you to take every and all means available to increase that capacity. And so I think if the numbers were of a scale where you are considering whether you need to do certain things or not, then having access to the logic and the evidence may have helped us make better decisions. As it happens, all of those targets were so far in excess of the capacity that we had at the time that I think I can honestly say it didn't influence our decision making as to whether we were going to pursue one route or another route. We were clearly needed to pursue all available routes.
Just looking to the future, do you think that fewer restrictions on not just the data but the analysis, the modelling, to somebody in your position looking to scale up medical technology at speed, would it be useful to try and reduce those restrictions, or do you think it's not a major issue?
I can't honestly say that was a major issue in this case. As a generally inquisitive person, I would have loved to have seen those figures at the time, but I can't honestly say I would have done anything differently if I'd have had them.
Looking at the procurement of ventilators in particular, you do note in your statement that the word ventilators does cover, or is often used or misused in the coverage of a lot of different types of treatment. We are hearing from Professor Munasinghe later today, who's probably better placed to cover that. But just for context, we're talking about a range of oxygen therapy treatments to support COVID patients, aren't we?
Yes.
In terms of the purchasing environment pre-pandemic, what you tell us is that before we got to the pandemic, getting a new intensive care ventilator was typically, is this a fair characterisation, a fairly long and slow process?
Absolutely.
Deliberately and by design?
Indeed.
Can you set out the main steps?
Typically, a trust would identify that they had a need either because they were creating new intensive care capacity or existing devices were reaching the end of the life. Clinicians would usually engage in a reasonably lengthy testing and assessment process, normally involving getting physical test devices from suppliers, forming a set of testing and evaluation criteria. A specification would be developed, a procurement process would then ensue. Once that had completed, a contract would be let, and a reasonably extensive training, familiarisation and onboarding process would then take place. For a trust adopting a new make or model of ventilator, this process could easily take a year or 18 months.
Hardly needs saying, I suspect, that you didn't have that kind of time when it came to the start of the pandemic. How would you describe the changes to that procurement process amid, as you say, a compressed timescale and a global stampede of demand? What were the key changes that you had to...
I think there were changes that we made, and there were also changes that the market and the environment made for us. I think the predominant change that we had to make was we were buying at a distance. We were often buying devices that we had never physically held in our hands before, and we were buying from specification. We were also initially engaging with a large range of intermediaries who had come into the market at that time. And the nature of the market demand was such that this was often a cash up front, make a decision within hours, otherwise someone else will buy the device. So the normal process of challenging suppliers and checking, does your device do this, can it do that, how does it respond in this situation, was not available to us, and we had to largely buy off-paper specifications at a distance.
So you've gone from literally months to hours, effectively, in some cases?
In some cases, minutes.
One other change, we've already touched upon NHS supply chain procurement. You note in your statement that it was NHS supply chain that held a number of standard framework agreements for the provision of ventilators. I was interested by this aspect of the time frame on that. You say this: from programme inception on the 3rd of March, requests for availability went to suppliers on the 4th of March, first contracts were placed on the 9th of March, and this route was largely exhausted by the 12th of March. So in a matter of days, the normal NHS supply chain route for the provision of these ventilators had evaporated.
I think that should also be taken as a success of NHS supply chain.
All right. Why is it you say that?
They provided, I think, close to 40% of the devices that we ended up using. All of those devices had previously gone through extensive testing and due diligence and had commercial value for money benchmarks on them. So we weren't paying COVID premiums for those devices. And they were able to very quickly deliver. So you could say it would be lovely if they had been able to deliver all of the requirements, but we were able to get, I think it was 40% of our intensive care ventilators that we ended up purchasing through that route in a very secure way very quickly. So I think those dates and that speed is an example of the supply chain procurement process working really well. The problem was that it couldn't give us everything that we needed.
It couldn't meet the demand.
Couldn't meet the demand.
One of the strategic issues, in your quite reflective statement, you've talked about some of the lessons you've learned about strategic issues facing medical technology. And you say that one of your key lessons learned from the pandemic experience is that NHS supply chains needs to either be given a clear mandate and associated funding to act as a supplier of last resort or not. At present, it's not commissioned to do this, but should issues arise, is expected to do this. In the context of the answers you've given there, could you just expand upon why you say that and what your lesson learned is about NHS supply chain here?
Well, NHS supply chain is designed effectively as an opt-in service that trusts can choose to use or can choose to do different things if they wish. There is no part of NHS supply chain which is designed or scaled to act as a provider of last resort.
And just to be clear, what is it you mean by that?
So when NHS trusts go to NHS supply chain, they go and say, I would like you to get this for me. And in the relationship between trusts and NHS supply chain, there is no commitment or no guarantee from NHS supply chain that they can supply those items. NHS supply chain is set up as effectively a best endeavours service. We will try and get you those items if we can. It's not set up as a service where we are guaranteeing as NHS supply chain to provide those items to you. They could provide that function, but they're not currently finance scaled or resourced to provide that function. The problem was in a pandemic, all of the NHS trusts suddenly turn to NHS supply chain and say, please give me these things. And NHS supply chain demand suddenly goes through the roof, and they are not scaled, planned, expecting to deal with that scale of response.
Thank you very much. One of the work streams we've heard about and that you alluded to earlier was the call to arms, and we've already heard from Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams about that. You do, just in relation to that, you do make the observation, your paragraph 66, that you recall saying to Steve Oldfield at DHSC that you saw no reasonable prospect of achieving the demand projection using the standard procurement and supply chain means, and that to materially improve our current projection, we would need significant additional support from across government. Is that right?
That's correct.
So we heard about the make drive. We'll be discussing later with another witness some of the work of the FCDO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which was mobilised to support the purchase of ventilators from overseas. You also note that the Ministry of Defence was tasked to offer additional support on procurement, logistics and transportation. Is all that right?
That's correct.
You make this point that on the 25th of March, your department and NHSE issued guidance to trusts setting out the scope of the national procurement effort and in effect asking them not to buy ventilators directly. Is that right?
That's correct.
Why was that done?
Partly it was done to try and avoid trusts competing with each other and with us to procure ventilators. At the time, intermediaries and suppliers who had devices were very keen to offer them to as many different people as possible in order to drive the price upwards. And we were actively discouraging throughout the entirety of March trusts from seeking to engage directly with suppliers and intermediaries. So I think the guidance that was issued on the 25th of March really formalised the position that had in fact been in effect from significantly earlier, if not from the start of that month.
In terms of offers that came through UK-based suppliers, you say your paragraph 75 that you and your programme were given a clear steer from ministers in line with agreement from the Treasury that the primary consideration was ensuring capacity to save lives over value for money. Is that right?
That's correct.
So the inquiry's already heard from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury at the time, Mr Barclay, about how that applied to PPE, possibly for obvious reasons. That clearly applied to your programme too, did it?
Yes.
You make this observation. In this context, decision-making was dominated by confidence and delivery risk rather than price considerations. Could you just give us a slightly more simple explanation of what that means?
So I think that means we accepted that we were going to be paying over the pre-pandemic price for all goods. And typically, we often paid up to double the pre-COVID price for items. That is not to say that price did not have any impact on our decision-making. And there were many items that we were offered that were at 10, 20, even 50 times the pre-pandemic price, which we chose not to pursue.
So if and when the inquiry looks at the question of what was spent, value for money, those types of key procurement questions,
Yep.
There was some measure of control exercised, was there?
Indeed, and I think the average price of the ventilator that I think we purchased through this initiative was £22,000 for an intensive care ventilator. The pre-pandemic norm for that was around £15,000. So we did pay a COVID premium, but we didn't pay exorbitant or extortionate amounts of money to secure stock at any price.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you some questions about clinical due diligence, if I may. Now, appreciating you're not a clinician, you're very clear about that, but you'll understand that it was obviously an important part of the procurement process, wasn't it, for a machine like a ventilator that has such obvious implications in terms of clinical safety. In terms of clinical due diligence, you say that once machines and equipment came in, is this right? They came to MOD Donington, where they were quarantined, and then it was a team of clinicians who actually undertook, a clinical due diligence process?
Yes, there were two stages
right
to the final process. For all new items that had not previously been used in the NHS, they would arrive at MOD Donington. They would be unpacked, and there was a clinical due diligence team with clinicians, and they would unbox a sample of the devices. They would check for obvious damage and also check that all of the necessary components were there and identify any issues with the devices that they could tell from a visual inspection. Things like, we need an adapter for this thing. We need a different type of oxygen sensor. It doesn't come with an expiratory block. We need to include one of those. We would then seek to rectify those issues, and the devices would then be sent to either MD Tech in Birmingham,
With Professor Clutton-Brock.
indeed, or to Nottingham with Dan Clark. They would test the devices in a lab environment, connecting them up to sensors, simulation equipment to assess their performance, and they would put the devices in one of 4 distinct categories. And that was the end process. That process was not in place on day 1. That process was in effect in there from about, I think, week 3 or so. So 1 or 2 devices did arrive before that process had been set up,
Right.
which we may come to later.
I suspect we may come to. But looking at those outcomes then, at risk of dwelling too much on figures here, I would like to know, there are 4, you say there were 4 different outcomes. So once you've unpacked it, you've remedied the immediate issues, and then there are, is this right, 4...
So the 4 outcomes are after the second stage
After the second
lab
stage,
testing.
understood. Outcome 1, de-quarantine the device and release them into the allocation process without further guidance. Is that right?
Correct?
That's the hope, presumably. That's the best
Yes.
outcome.
Although, frankly, these are very complicated devices.
Of course.
And very few of those devices would require no further guidance whatsoever.
Understood. Although you say that accounted for 4 of the new models of ventilators
Yes.
purchased and assessed by your programme. Yeah?
Correct.
Outcome 2, de-quarantine and release into the allocation process, as you say, accompanied by some guidance, a guidance note about what you call necessary workarounds to assist in safe operations. What does that mean, please?
That means that we were able to deploy them, but there was a set of guidance notes that went out. Now, those guidance notes could have been as simple as, I remember for one device, the power button was in an unusual place on the back of the device. And the guidance note literally was, the power button is where you don't expect it. You know, it's of something that's of no real consequence. And indeed, some of those range to more complex feedback, saying, you know, this setting works like this rather than like this, and if you're going to do this, you probably need to do that as well.
Right.
And so some of that is more complicated, some of that is more simple, but these are, you know, green-lighted to go out into the system as a result of that testing process.
With a note attached.
With a note attached.
Again, that's another 4 of the models purchased through the programme, is that right?
Yes.
Outcome 3, hold the device in quarantine pending supply of additional components, communications, or resolutions to issues identified. That might be obvious. It looks okay, but we haven't got the right pipes or something like that.
Could be that, or we haven't got the right oxygen sensor, or actually the training manual needs these things to be clarified, and there is work to do before we can safely distribute and deploy these devices.
That was 6 models.
Yes.
Finally, do not release the device into the allocation process.
Yes.
Reasons of safety, presumably, clinical concern.
Or that there were potentially issues that we didn't believe we could address in a reasonably quick or easy time frame.
In time,
So,
understood. Yeah. And that was 2 models. Importantly, you say in terms of the spend on these models, outcomes 1 and 2, they were what you were hoping for, presumably.
Yes.
That covered 92.5% of the device spend, did it?
Correct.
Outcome 3 was 3.7%, and outcome 4 was 3.4%, so significantly smaller figures. What, Mr. Sterling, did the figures, in terms of the categories that these new devices ended up in, tell us, in your view, about the overall value for money of the programme?
I think in terms of our ability to secure appropriate quality devices, I think it shows that we overcame the challenge of trying to buy at distance reasonably well. You know, we were buying off a specification off a piece of paper, and when the devices turned up and we then put them through a test process, yes, some of them didn't do what we wanted them to do, but the majority of the money we spent was on devices that did what we were expecting and hoping they would do.
that were safe and usable within the NHS context.
And were deployed into and then used by the NHS.
You note that as part of the initial surge response, as you call it, trusts were requesting, again, perhaps for obvious reasons, that your programme send them ventilators as quickly as possible.
Yes.
You say at that point, speed of arrival was their overwhelming priority in order to build capacity ahead of expected demand. Yeah?
Correct.
And in line with that priority, your initial operating process was to deliver devices to trusts without undertaking any additional testing or checking process steps. Is that what you were saying? Is that 3-week period before those?
Agreed, yes. So in the very early weeks, the pressure from trusts was to deliver devices to them directly. And in that period, we had not yet set up the testing processes and systems. So for a very small number of devices that arrived in those first weeks, they were delivered to trusts without the testing and checking process that we've just gone through.
You say that for devices that trusts were familiar with, generally that was fine, I think, is the tenor of your statement. Clinical and engineering teams understood them, had previous experience, and they could deal with any anticipated challenges. But you say for devices that were new to trusts, or indeed new to the NHS, that approach created a variety of issues, from the relatively straightforward but time-consuming, things like the wrong plug or the wrong connector, through to what you call deeper concerns about device quality and safety. Is that right?
And I think there I'm principally referring to the Shangrila devices,
right,
which I'm sure you will come to.
We will. You'll understand that the context for these questions, Mr. Sterling, is that obviously the inquiry's received a number of statements from across the NHS and representative bodies, some of which you will have seen do raise concerns. I want to look first, please, at INQ 000536367. This is the witness statement of Ashley Shaw, the Medical Director of Cambridge University Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust. Paragraph 28, I'm just going to read it to you if I may, Mr. Sterling. Adult critical care ventilators were provided by the government, which were a completely new model to the trust. While initial support for the installation and training of these devices was provided, there did not appear to be long-term plans in place in relation to ongoing training, maintenance, spare parts and consumables provision. Many teams had to take the minimal training materials and train themselves in the specific nuances of the devices based on previous experiences. In addition, many of the devices and consumables came from China, and the instructions for use and associated documentation was accordingly in Chinese. On occasion, DHSC and NHSE endeavoured to obtain translations of the documentation, but these varied in quality. Before we get to any specific devices, do you recognise those types of issues arising? Did that kind of feedback reach you and your team?
I absolutely recognise the issues, and initially we did not have long-term support and maintenance plans in place. Over time they were put in place, as you would expect, but the initial focus was very much on securing the capacity and then providing those support arrangements subsequently. There is a reference here to minimal training materials. I think that is very fair. I think we need to put that in context, though, in that normally the training process for a new ventilator device would be very extensive, and that in the time and pressure that trusts were under, clearly we were not able to undertake that degree of training and familiarisation that we all would have liked. I think the training materials themselves improved over time, largely due to feedback from trusts. So I very much recognise these issues. I think we worked to try and address them, but certainly on day one, a lot of these things were not in place, as you will. I think this statement, this is Cambridge, isn't it? So,
yes.
They predominantly took a device which had a long-term support relationship from Ortus, and so those things appeared, but were not there on day one.
before we turn to any other specific devices, I want to give you a chance to set the context, because in your statement you say as follows. It's your paragraph 122 if you need the reference. It's important to emphasise that ventilators are highly complicated technology devices requiring regular support and maintenance. That was the focus of that paragraph there, wasn't it, from the shore? You say this: as such, it's not unusual for devices to encounter problems, and there were and continue to be a regular stream of upgrades, safety notices and refinements to instructions, etc., regardless of product quality. Similarly, product recalls are not uncommon and typically reflect clinicians and suppliers' desire to reduce potential risks, however small they be. Yes?
Okay.
So we'll bear that in mind when we look at these devices. You're effectively saying people are hyper-vigilant about safety in such complex devices and in the context in which they're used. Is that?
That's correct. And also I think it's important to recognise that many of the safety notices that are published are examples of suppliers being diligent and making sure that they are flagging potential risks. I'm also aware of some perception that if you have a high number of safety notices related to a device, that device is therefore unsafe. It is often actually, on the contrary, what that is showing is that the supplier is being extremely diligent in publishing and communicating any potential issues about devices.
All right, we'll take that as background context when we look at the device you mentioned earlier, known as the Shangrila 510S. Yeah?
Yes.
I want to turn up, please, first INQ 000520831. This is the witness statement from another trust, Mr. Sterling. This is Toby Lewis, Chief Executive at the time of the Sandwell and West Birmingham Hospitals NHS Trust. Paragraph 6. Our need for ventilators had been duly registered in submissions made to NHS Midlands. Our projected figures were wholly consistent over time and consistent with our agreed plans. Until the time specified in the following paragraph, which we'll come to, I had no forewarning of who, how, or when decisions about allocation or specification would be made. This made it difficult to prepare teams of staff for receipt or manage their understandable anxiety about our future readiness in respect to ventilators, yeah? Just pausing there, one of the things that you note in your statement, and one of the key parts of your programme, was communications, is that right?
Correct.
You say a key aspect to the programme was communicating positions to trusts, both directly and through regional networks, yeah? This here, I don't want to be unfair, but it looks like an incident, doesn't it? An instance where communication with a particular trust was less effective than it might have been, to put it neutrally.
Agreed.
Was that something that you were able to improve over time? Overall communication with trusts about what they're getting, when they're getting it, who made the decision and why?
I think the allocation process worked predominantly with regional stakeholders, and regional stakeholders manage the majority of the communications to individual trusts. Our team would deal with individual trusts around specific delivery arrangements and specific issues and challenges, but the majority of the request allocation process was dealt with at a regional level. We published on a daily basis the lists of devices and the inbound schedule of devices that we were to receive, and trusts would engage with their regional teams about their requirements and put in effectively requests for devices from those. Now, clearly in this example, that communication has not worked as effectively as it should. I perceive that generally it worked better than this particular example would demonstrate. I think it also got better over time, and there were a number of significant communication activities to representatives from all trusts saying this is how we are working, this is what we are doing.
All right.
I think there is also the last point here is I think probably in my view, the most important one. We were, through this point, not having sufficient stock to meet all of the requests that we had in. And I think somewhere else in this statement, the author refers to it as a just-in-time model. We would love to have had sufficient quantities of devices to not operate a just-in-time model. But unfortunately, the reality of our stock position and the number of demands that were coming in was that we weren't able to do that.
Moving on to the specific devices, we can see paragraph 7 on the screen. On the 6th of April 2020, we received ventilators, which we'd been alerted to on the 3rd. We received 30 Shangrila 510 ventilators, directly sourced by DHSC, NHSE, from a Chinese supplier, and delivery came, as you've said, through MOD Donington. The point made in the next paragraph is that the scale of that delivery made to the Trust was 25% less than we had asked for and required for our approved plan. Again, what's said there is it was unclear how this decision had been made or by whom. I think you may have covered that in your last answer.
I think we frequently delivered people less than they asked for, but we believed we always delivered them more than they needed. And I think later on in this statement, that point is echoed about the Trust having sufficient ventilation capacity. In terms of how the decision has been made, we operated a process of daily device allocation panels, which were chaired by Professor Keith Willett and had regional representation, typically regional medical directors or their delegates, representing the requests and needs of their region.
If we could go over to paragraph 11, please. On receipt, this is of this particular device. Our engineering and clinical teams sought to assess the functionality and capability of the equipment received. Limited of information was available to work with. Initially, the Shangrila ventilators were unusable as supplied, as the oxygen piping and connectors were not UK standard. The oxygen fuel cells were unusable without modification, and the supplied breathing circuits were multi-use but had no sterilisation instructions. There was no UK representation of the parent company and no one we could obtain advice or consumables from. We then invested significant time modifying the ventilators so that we could even test them in our engineering workshop, let alone use them on a patient. We also invested significant time trying to construct a disposable breathing circuit that could safely be used by utilising available components from assorted UK suppliers. And over at paragraph 14, please. The delivery of ventilators we received came with just 2 days of consumables necessary to use such ventilators and no information about future consumable supply. This, in addition to the underlying issues, meant that we were unable to plan to use the ventilators to the extended extent. Any use of the machines was exploratory and under close senior clinical supervision over the latter part of the week commencing the 5th of April. Clearly, Mr. Sterling, quite significant concerns from the clinician's
Indeed.
point of view. What is it you want to say about this particular device, why it ended up where it did, and what was done to address those concerns?
So this was the very first device that arrived.
Right.
And it arrived prior to the establishment of the testing processes. And as we talked about before, was delivered straight to a trust without having gone through that test cycle. It was a device that was from a new supplier, new to the NHS. It was also a transport ventilator, which we thought could potentially be used in an intensive care environment. I think it's also important to say that the device itself is extensively used in other parts of the world, particularly in China and the Far East, and is from one of their very reputable ventilator manufacturers. The specification for the device had been given to clinicians to see whether they believed it could fulfill a need. And on the basis of the paper specification, we had decided to procure these devices. These were also very low-cost devices, as I mentioned earlier, I think the average price of an intensive care ventilator we bought was £22,000 a unit. I think these devices were around £3,000 a unit. They were purchased on the basis that we were currently at that point in time projecting to be incredibly short of devices and looking to see whether devices such as this could fulfill a gap in an emergency. The feedback we got from the West Midlands from their testing and evaluation of this device was very disappointing. And I think that was communicated to Professor Munisinghe, who you're seeing later, on the 12th of April. And the ventilators were withdrawn from the allocation process and recalled on the 13th of April.
And in fact, if we look, please, at INQ 000 514 215, I show you that page, that's your name and the date of the 13th of August of 2020.
Yeah.
But if we go up to the top, please, the first page, we don't need to go into any detail here, but we can see this is a note from you called Shangrila 510S cancellation refund position. So by August, you were seeking to cancel the orders, which you describe as now surplus to requirements. And if this recommendation, your recommendation, is that right, Mr. Sterling, was accepted, DHSC would expect to receive a refund in the sum of 2.8 million and make a loss of approximately 1.2 million on that transaction.
That's correct. There are some things between then and this letter that probably should be noted.
Okay.
We immediately worked to cancel down future orders.
Yep.
We then subsequently put this device through the testing process that we discussed earlier. And it is one of those two devices that ended up in outcome 4.
Didn't make it.
The least preferred outcome. Importantly, we also used that process to understand whether there were any discrepancies against the specification. Things that we could go back and say to the manufacturer, your device did not do what it was supposed to do. And importantly, the conclusion from the test lab was that whilst they were equally disappointed with the performance, there was no smoking gun that they could say, it didn't do this, therefore you can, have a contractual recourse of some nature. Therefore, we engaged with the manufacturer of those devices and sought to negotiate a refund. And I think further down in this note, I think it says they offered us, I think it was a 70%.
It's exactly that.
Refund.
Yeah, we don't need to go in detail tonight, but you achieved, and one of the documents you provide in your statement suggests that was in fact received, not long thereafter. So a 70% refund was achieved. Importantly there, you say you used did you use the learning from that experience to try and...
I think this, as the first device to arrive, was instrumental in helping us set the processes up to make sure that future devices, as they arrive, were properly tested, no matter what the pressure from NHS trusts to receive devices promptly might have been.
Thank you. I want to look very briefly, please, before we break, at issues which arose around another device and how you sought to tackle those and the learning that was taken forward there. This is the UCL Ventura, a continuous positive airway pressure, or CPAP, form of oxygen therapy. Is that right?
That's correct.
You tell us that early work for that device had been carried out as part of the ventilator challenge, about which we've already heard, but it ultimately didn't come through that process. Can we look, please, at INQ 000 514 162? This... Yes.
Yeah, I recognise this.
You recognise this, very good. This is your submission for the purchase of these devices, is that right, in treating COVID-19 patients?
That's correct.
Could we go to page 4, please? Can you see under this, I wanted to briefly ask you about this. Let's set the context. There's a CPAP device. You're recommending in this document that they are purchased. Is that broadly it?
That's correct.
Under the heading publicity, at paragraph 22 here, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster has already announced on the 31st of March that the NHS has already ordered a quantity of these devices. This was in line with the ongoing contractual discussions at the time. Can I ask you, did the fact that that had already been announced in any way affect your decision to recommend the purchase? This wasn't, was it, procurement by press release in some way?
No. We had already, the contractual paperwork, including this formalisation submission, took a while to complete, as these things do. And so we had previously discussed and engaged in discussions with UCL around our intention to buy these devices. So I think this is press release getting slightly ahead of factual, and I think if he had announced that we intended to, or that we were planning to, or working with UCL to, then he would have been absolutely spot on. At that point, we had not technically ordered the devices or placed the contract to do so.
I want to know whether this created any form of ministerial pressure that led to some of the later issues.
I don't think this created any pressure or influenced the decision in any way, shape or form. It was something we were committed to working towards, and this is the submission that formalises that.
Thank you, that's very clear. If we just look at paragraphs 19 to 21 then briefly, this is under the heading over the page, risks is what's headed above there. Some risks were noted, weren't they, in relation to this device, which you've clearly set out.
Agreed, although these are not risks that are exclusively associated with this device.
Absolutely.
Risks with all CPAP devices. And indeed, one of the key benefits of this device was that it used less oxygen than some other CPAP devices, even though in relative terms, that is still quite a lot of oxygen.
You say, whilst oxygen systems have alarms designed to prevent this happening, so trust systems failing, we can see in 19, even relatively short interruptions in supply could have significant patient safety impacts, for quite obvious reasons. To mitigate this, extensive work is being done with trusts to ensure that they understand and work within their oxygen flow constraints. Devices will be appropriately labelled and contain significant warnings to ensure that they are only used in appropriate situations. So that was what you noted. Unfortunately, what we can see from one trust is that labelling and warning became one of the issues with this device, didn't it?
I think the labelling was always more restrictive than the usage authorisation.
I see.
So there were 3 labels at different times that should have been on these devices.
Can I pause you there, Mr. Sterling, if I may?
Yep.
Let me put the context for that question and then give you an opportunity to answer it in the way that you may just have been about to. The context for this question is another trust statement, I think the last I'll refer you to. This is the Royal Surrey NHS Foundation Trust. Lawrence, please, INQ 000512921, paragraph 6.6. Statement of Louise Stead and Jackie Tingle of that trust. DHSC provided us with, and then a number of figures are given about different devices. We don't need to go through them all, but there's 10 of a GE device, 80 Flow-Ox oxygen monitors, 26 Vision Air 5 portable concentrators, and in the middle there we see 80 of these UCL Ventura CPAPs that you and I are discussing. What Ms Stead and Ms Tingle say is that other than the Vision Air 5 portable oxygen concentrators, these devices were not used, primarily due to safety concerns of non-standardised devices, lack of appropriate consumables, and no competency training for clinical teams. For example, the UCL ventilators had labels advising they should not be used for clinical use. That's quite the restrictive label.
I'm not sure that is the complete text of the label.
All right.
So my recollection is that there were 3 labels. The first label said for test and evaluation purposes only, which was the most restrictive of the conditions, and that was to enable the devices to be used specifically in line with MHRA testing requirements. The second label said should not be used for clinical use outside of the pandemic. And I think this may have chopped the last few words of that only.
All right.
Because MHRA exceptional use authorisation, once granted, had been given for COVID-19 patients only. And the third label was a general, you can now use this for anything label in line with the standard things. The normal process for relabelling devices is that you recall all of the devices, get them sent back to you physically, you change the label on the device yourself, and then you send the device back out. Given that in many cases these devices were being used for patient care, that was clearly inappropriate to do that, and it was agreed with MHRA that we should have a modified process where we sent the labels out to the trusts for them to overlabel the devices. Clearly, in a pandemic environment, relabelling the devices was unlikely to be the trust's priority action, and I'm aware that many of those devices were not relabelled, and so effectively had potentially an earlier label rather than an older label. Said that wrong.
The next witness from whom we're hearing, or one of the next witnesses, I should say, as you're aware, is Professor Ramani Munasinghe. I want to bring up one paragraph of her statement, please. INQ 000518349, page 31. It's paragraph 115. And just to conclude this section of questions before, my lady, if we take our break. Professor Munasinghe will tell us, I'm sure, that she had quite a significant role, didn't she?
She did.
In deciding which bits of kit, in particular which ventilators and associated consumables were procured and weren't. She says this: although the target number of machines was achieved, the quality of the machines and their suitability for use in the NHS to treat COVID-19 or other conditions was variable. There were also shortages of other essential items, including some medicines and consumable items. These limitations meant that clinicians were not always able to treat patients with their first choice of interventions. Now, on clinical choice, you might be happy, everyone might be happy to hear that my suggestion is we deal with that after we've had a break, because I suspect there is a bit to say, Mr. Sterling. But on the quality of what was procured, Professor Munasinghe's view is it's variable, and that certainly seems to be the flavour of the statements I've put to you. Do you agree with that conclusion?
I think it clearly was variable. The simple reality was we would have loved to have only procured the highest quality equipment all of the time, but we were simply not able to achieve the targets by doing that. So we had to look for alternative sources. And I think if we go back to the Cambridge statement from earlier, they ended up with a mixed fleet of servo devices that they had originally and devices that we had procured for them. I don't think there's any doubt they would have much preferred to have had an entire fleet of their first choice servo devices. I would have if I was in their position. However, we were not in an ability to supply that. So we had to supply other devices that were not necessarily as fully functional and didn't have all of the features that their first choice device would have done. I think that's reasonably self-evident.
Do you think that this variability in quality was a result of having to procure in such large numbers at such speed?
Yes. Clearly, if we'd have had, 10 years to build up the numbers that we needed, we would have been able to operate differently and secure more first choice devices for trusts.
My lady, just before we turn to the next topic, that might be a convenient moment.
Certainly. You're probably warned that we take a break, but I promise you we will finish your evidence before lunch. 11:45, please.
Thank you.
Mr. Stode.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Sterling, I'd like to turn now, please, to some questions possibly foreshadowed by the last answers you were giving about allocation of goods and the question of clinical choice. In other words, Did the clinicians get a choice? To what extent did they get that choice, and how was that challenge addressed? You say in your statement that an allocation process was developed to ensure that the devices we've been discussing were appropriately and fairly distributed. Yeah? Could you talk us through what process was developed?
So the process worked as follows. We would distribute to trusts via regional teams a list of the ventilation devices and equipment that we had available, together with a projection of our incoming stock, so they could see what was coming down the line.
What you had and what was coming.
What we had, what was coming.
Yeah.
And obviously in the pandemic environment, we didn't always get what was coming exactly right, but at least I had an idea of what was coming. Trusts were then invited to put in requests for equipment, and those requests were arrived at us through the regional teams. And so the requests that we ended up considering were ones that had come from trusts, had the support of the regional teams. And those were requests for individual devices and device types, because they could see the makes and models of the things. And obviously, some of the devices we had were incredibly popular, and some of the devices that we had were less popular. We operated two different models. One for during surge conditions, where we distributed devices on the basis of urgent clinical need. And in those situations, we would look at a trust's ventilation and intensive care capacity. We would look at the number of patients that they had within that, and what degree of free capacity they had, and the rate of change of that. And on the basis of that, we would say, yes, you have an urgent need for additional capacity, in which case we would prioritise that request. Outside of surge times, we operated a capacity building model where we would seek to help trusts build and create capacity for the next surge. In terms of the devices, we would try and make sure that wherever possible, trusts were using familiar devices or using a small number of different devices. Clearly, if we're going to give people unfamiliar devices, it's better for us to give them 20 of the same unfamiliar device rather than 20 different devices. And we would also prioritise those organisations that had small needs and small capacity over those that had very large needs. So, for example, the Cambridge example we were using earlier, I think they ended up from that statement with 67 VG70s that we supplied.
That's a model of ventilator.
That's a model of ventilator
Yeah.
that we sourced as part of the new novel sourcing process. We had a very small number of servo devices, which I believe would have been their preferred make and model, but we would have delivered them to an organisation that maybe only needed 2 or 3 extra ventilators, in which case we were able to keep them on their same device type. Whereas with Cambridge, they were going to have to use 2 different device types because there was no way that we were going to be able to supply them with 70 additional servo devices. So we would try and prioritise the models to reduce variation from people's initial device choices. However, we weren't always able to do that, and there were situations where we had to give people more variability in devices than they would have liked.
You talk in your statement about the National Ventilation Allocation Panel.
Yes.
How did that, first of all, what was that, and how did it fit into this process you're talking about?
So the National Ventilation Allocation Panel was the decision-making group that was comprised of regional representatives and chaired by Keith Willett or one of his deputies that made the decisions about which devices were sent where. So effectively the culmination of the process that I've described of, we provide lists to trust of what makes and models we've got coming in when. They put requests in, those are considered by the regional teams, and then at that National Ventilation Allocation Panel, typically 3 o'clock, 7 days a week, the decisions would be taken on which devices would be sent to which trusts. those would typically be communicated to the warehouse by 4, and the devices would be delivered either that evening or typically early the following morning.
We'll come back to the question of, in a moment, please, about which devices and who wanted what in terms of models and makes and so forth. In terms of the question of how many, was that also a question for the National Ventilation Allocation Panel? We've got this many, we can see your need, you can have X.
Exactly.
I want to put to you, please, a part of the statement of Professor Banfield, Chair of the British Medical Association, the BMA's UK Council. It's INQ 000562457, paragraph 262. And just invite your views, if I may, please. Professor Banfield tells us intensive care provision was stretched across the UK during the pandemic, despite capacity being increased in a variety of ways, including using spare and new ventilator machines, altering staffing patterns, redeploying doctors from other departments, and expanding into other clinical areas beyond the normal ITU footprint, such as recovery areas. And with this, there were at times localised shortages of ventilators, which necessitated the transfer of patients between hospitals and the use of anaesthetic machines in lieu of ventilators, and the use of anaesthetic machines. Forgive me, that's it, that's the end of it. I think it might have been duplicated in the sentence there, but the point is he's saying there were at times, in the BMA's view, localised shortages of ventilators which necessitated transfer between hospitals. And then if we look down, please, at paragraph 264, impact on members, shortages of ventilators for the numbers of patients who might benefit, combined with a lack of government or NHS guidance on clinical prioritisation, put additional pressure and uncertainty on doctors during an already highly stressful period. Circumstances in which demand outstrips supply raise serious ethical and professional challenges and give rise to the potential for moral injury amongst those doctors responsible for making final decisions on care escalation, as well as wider concerns about the potential for discrimination in the application of criteria. Focusing then on what's said here, because I'm asking you again about the how many. Localised shortages of ventilators which necessitated transfers and caused this impact on BMA members. First, do you recognise that as a concern which arose?
Could we go back to 262?
Yes, of course.
The previous one?
Yeah.
That'd be very helpful, thank you. So, I think I've got a slightly different view on this. A critical care transfer of a ventilated patient is a considerable and difficult undertaking and not something the system would do lightly. It's comparably significantly easier to move a ventilator to where it's needed. So I don't dispute that there were transfers of patients between hospitals to places where there was greater clinical care, critical care capacity. I am not aware of any situation where the reason for that transfer was that there was no ventilator. I think it's very clear that at times in different parts of the system, critical care was extremely challenged. What I'm not aware of is any time where there was critical care capacity, there's workforce, oxygen, medicines, beds, all set up, but no ventilator. To the best of my knowledge, that did not happen. So I think there's a bit of a sort of switching between shortage of ventilators and shortage of critical care capacity here.
For which ventilators is a vital
It's a component,
part.
but a part of.
Exactly, but one component of.
That broader picture.
All right.
So I think, that the use of anaesthetic machines in lieu of ventilators, I think, was relatively common at the time and clearly not optimal. I'm not the person to talk to the clinical appropriateness of that or
Indeed.
not, but I'm aware that that was part of what was quite widespread at the time. So I think that agree with that bit of it. And clearly on 264, there is no doubt that not having the machine that you are familiar with and lots of it available will increase stress and pressure in the clinical community. So these points about the fact that you haven't got your ideal first choice and you haven't got confidence that you've got a lot of it, clearly that's going to create pressure.
Yes.
But I do disagree with the core premise that there were localised shortages. If there were, I'm not aware of it, and that's not something that we've seen evidenced previously.
Thank you. Let's look then at the question of clinical choice. Just to set the background, you make a number of points in your witness statement about clinician choice. First, paragraph 12, you call it a key structural element of the UK health system. Yeah?
Agreed.
Paragraph 57, you say within intensive care environments, clinicians generally have strong preferences about the ventilators they use and a reluctance to change. These preferences typically arise from the impact that familiarity and consistency have on reducing patient risk. So in other words, an understandable preference.
Agreed.
And in paragraph 116, you say this about the process we've just been talking about. In determining what makes and models of devices to provide to trusts, attempts, you say, will be made to provide consistent device types, reducing variation and complexity for clinicians. So not always possible. I think that was the conclusion of what you said about that. Is that right?
Yes.
I want to look briefly, please, at the position that we've been told about in Scotland.
Okay.
Can I bring up INQ 000498141? This is the witness statement, Mr. Sterling, of Caroline Lamb, Chief Executive of NHS Scotland and Director General of Health and Social Care. I'm going to look at paragraph 314. Ms Lamb here is talking about the Scottish Government ICU Resilience and Support Group, which in Scotland led coordination and decisions on procurement and distribution of ventilators. And she says this: for ICU ventilators and equipment, the focus was equipping up to the maximum surge level 3 ICU beds to deliver double capacity, 406 beds, up to the maximum surge level 3 ICU beds or 714 beds, caveated by the ability to staff ICU beds. And then this: the approach adopted by the ICU Resilience and Support Group in Scotland from the start was to take a human factors approach, i.e. purchasing and using only familiar brands or brands that NHS boards were using already where possible. This meant that staff working under extreme pressure were not also having to learn to work with new specialised equipment and enabled the equipment to be utilised by boards post-COVID. Does that in any way differ from the approach that was taken in England, Mr. Sterling? Does that sound like in any way a different approach?
I'm not sure it does sound different. I think the key words I would look at here are where already where possible.
Yes.
So clearly I think both in Scotland and more broadly in the UK, the preference was to use familiar brands and models that people are familiar with. However, the challenge was, I think, either in Scotland or in the rest of the UK, whether we were going to achieve those high volume targets with those familiar brands. I don't think anyone was trying to introduce new things because we thought that was a good thing to do. We thought that was a necessary thing to do.
One of the reasons I've been asking you these questions, Mr. Sterling, is because of an observation you make in the reflections and lesson learned section of your witness statement. This is your paragraph 203C. And you say this: the pandemic has highlighted the cost of choice. I'll just put what it says here and then ask you to expand on it, if I may. You say this: the importance, advantages and disadvantages of choice have long been debated. The pandemic experience has shown that clinicians can, even under pressure, successfully switch products. It has also highlighted the significant cost and complexity of operating the current choice max, as you call it, environment. Clearly, clinical choice needs to remain central to both clinical practice and innovation, but overall, you say, the pandemic has materially weakened the case for choice. What do you mean by that? Can you just expand on why it is you say the pandemic has weakened the case for choice by clinicians in terms of these devices?
I think when looking at device selection, there's a number of factors that influence that. And historically, the NHS system has always prioritised clinical choice above almost all other factors. Resilience implications, industrial strategy considerations are typically not part of that broader clinician choice consideration. And I think the pandemic has highlighted the quite considerable costs, both financially and in terms of performance, of having such choice embedded at a fundamental level within the system. Clearly, I'm not advocating that we should move from an environment where we have, choice max, as I describe it, to one where you say everybody must use this product, because clearly that has resilience implications of its own. But I think if there is this, this spectrum of choice from, direction here through to maximum choice over here, the NHS is here. And I think there is an opportunity for us in our long-term procurement and supply of these devices to move towards a little bit more where we can have structured long-term partnerships with a smaller number of suppliers that enables us to have longer-term resilience and also enables us to respond more effectively to situations like this. And to simpler things like, staff moving between hospitals, finding they have to familiarise themselves with completely different sets of equipment. And that has quality and safety implications of its own. So I'm by no means advocating a more draconian approach, but I think we have to be honest that the degree of choice which is embedded within the NHS system has a cost, and the pandemic has shown us, both in terms of quality and pound signs, what that is.
Thank you. Just to conclude this area of questions, I want to show you a document, again drafted by you. It's INQ 000541370, titled, this one?
Yep, know this one.
It's always pleasing when you recognise a document.
It is.
That's my aim. This one was there. It's your name on it, so it's from you to Mr. Oldfield. We know. Yep.
Oh no, this one's to the Minister
cleared
of
by
State
Mr.
Health.
Oldfield.
Yes.
Forgive me. To the Secretary of State. Forgive me. And a document titled "The Medium-Term Strategy to Ensure Continued Availability of Oxygen, Ventilation, and Medical Consumables, including procuring a stockpile of COVID-19 related ICU consumables." If we could just look, please, at page 2. Paragraphs 2 to 3. This seems to be your summary of this first part of the work of your programme. During the first surge of COVID-19, the Oxygen, Ventilation and Medical Devices and Clinical Consumables programme has delivered a wide range of activities to ensure the availability of oxygen therapies associated with critical care treatments within the NHS. Whilst this work has been successful in that there has not been any reported shortage of oxygen or ventilation adversely impacting patient outcomes, it has, on occasion, been uncomfortably close. It was that phrase I wanted to ask you about, Mr. Sterling, if I may. What was uncomfortably close about the work of your programme with regard to what we've been discussing this morning?
I think in, both on terms of ventilation and equipment, oxygen and consumables, the quantities that we had available, we managed to prioritise and deploy across the system. If COVID cases had been 10% or 20% higher, we might not have been in a stage where we were able to make the first half of that statement and say that we have no reported shortages of those items. It certainly wasn't comfortable. I don't think there is any particular deeper meaning to that statement than saying, you know, we were uncomfortably close in many cases.
That's very clear, thank you. Does that apply as much to the devices we've been talking about as it does to oxygen?
I think the timeline of shortage or maximum constraint was different for different items.
All right.
So for ventilation devices, our position of greatest shortage was on day one. For consumables, it was probably towards the end of the first wave. And for oxygen, it would have been the peak of the second wave in January 21.
That's very clear. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I'm going to ask you then briefly about oxygen. Thank you, Lawrence. A key challenge, you say, in your programme when you started out was that this is your paragraph 169, Mr. Sterling, to orientate you.
Thank you.
Was that there was no central system-wide understanding of how the healthcare oxygen infrastructure worked. Rather mirrors the concerns about not much data, no data on ventilators. You say there was no central system-wide understanding of the oxygen infrastructure. Is that right?
That's correct.
No clear national owner, you say, or centre of expertise, and within trust systems, which had often been configured and set up a very long time ago. Yeah?
Agreed.
And you say also that some of that expertise, such as it was had declined over time. That's your paragraph 169. This is from your paragraph 29. The additional capacity built over the summer period of the pandemic placed significant extra pressure on oxygen infrastructure, which became a primary constraint. In line with expectations, there was significant usage of the consumable stockpiles and limited use of residual capacity, excepting oxygen infrastructure. Despite daily oxygen management process and resources being severely tested, your words, at a system level, oxygen capacity plans held. So can we turn to that then? What was the nature of the severe test of the oxygen infrastructure system?
So I think at some point in the statement, I'm struggling to find where there is an illustration of that in terms of the number of trusts that were using, 50%, 80%, 100% of their oxygen.
Yes, I think it's your 182, if that
182.
helps. Yeah, around there.
Thank you. You know this better than I do. Yes. So in normal times, pre-COVID, a trust would expect to run at 20, 30, 40% oxygen capacity.
Right. Just explain to us in simple terms what that means. You've got oxygen is produced, isn't it, in very simple terms between non-clinicians here, Mr. Sterling, through something called a vacuum-insulated evaporator, or VIE.
Not quite.
Very good.
So
Help us out.
oxygen is typically produced in effectively a factory.
Right.
Called an air separation unit.
Okay.
Which looks, to all extents, like a factory, makes oxygen. And from there it is shipped in cryogenic tankers to trusts.
Right.
And is put in liquid form in the vacuum-insulated evaporators.
I see.
Which is where you were.
I got that bit.
That's where you were.
Very good.
And this is effectively a huge tank that sits outside the hospital with very cold liquid oxygen in it. There is then a set of equipment called an evaporator and a control panel that converts the liquid oxygen to gaseous oxygen and pumps it into the series of pipes that run through the hospital to get to the bedside. So from an oxygen infrastructure perspective, there are a number of things that can go wrong. At your factory, you can not make enough. In your distribution, you can not get enough to the tank in the hospital. Your tank in the hospital can run out. The equipment that converts the liquid to gaseous cannot operate at sufficient capacity, so you just can't turn it into gas fast enough. Or you can have insufficient pipe work in the hospital to be able to serve all the different places that you need to deliver at any given time. So those are the sort of potential points in failure. Now, the first of those we managed to mitigate very effectively. And our biggest problem...
Pausing there, you mean getting enough oxygen to the tank?
Making enough oxygen,
Yeah.
delivering it, getting to the tanks was... I don't believe that we have any issues across the pandemic environment with those stages. As a lot of people worked very hard to make sure that was the case, but I believe that was fine. Where we had the biggest issues were in the technical equipment that converts the liquid to a gas, and particularly in the pipe work within trusts. Now, it's relatively easy. I say relatively easy. You know, again, in peacetime, it would still be a 6-9 month project, but we had people doing this in days and weeks to upgrade the equipment so that you can make more gaseous oxygen quickly. And our industrial partners became very adept at high-speed upgrades of those components. What is much more difficult is to replace the pipe work, typically buried within the walls of the hospitals, some of which were designed a very long time ago, because you've got to get to the pipes and you've got to make them bigger, typically. And that's very hard to do at the best of times, and even harder to do if you're mid-pandemic. So that was where the majority of our discomfort comes, and that's why the figures that you have here...
Yes, can you just set those out for us? So normal capacity, you're looking at 20 to 40, you said?
20 to 40.
Yeah. And how did that change over the pandemic, and why?
So as intensive care and also the general oxygen support to COVID patients not in intensive care increased, oxygen usage within trusts increased significantly. And so the rate of conversion of liquid to gaseous oxygen went, you know, the figures as per 0.182. In January 21, we had 55 trusts, 10 over 80, and 5 trusts over 100%. So those are trusts that are, according to the paperwork, running their system far higher and hotter, or in this case cooler, than was ever intended. Now, thankfully there is some resilience in those specifications, so people were able to successfully operate oxygen systems at above 100%, but that is clearly not sustainable, recommended.
Or potentially safe.
Or potentially safe. However, I'll leave it there.
Okay. Just in terms of the steps taken then to bring that down, so we've got a situation by January 21 that you've told us about. How did your programme, briefly please, mitigate those effects? What in procurement terms, what was done?
So in procurement terms, we worked with oxygen providing organisations to upgrade components of infrastructure, and NHS England provided a variety of financing to trusts to enable them to remove bottlenecks within their pipework systems. Our team also produced a series of oxygen best practice guidance to help trusts use less oxygen, which was actually surprisingly effective, because prior to the pandemic, nobody had really put much effort into optimising oxygen usage. And I think we also worked to swap out higher oxygen flow usage devices for lower oxygen flow usage devices. So these are devices that have the same clinical benefit, but simply consume less oxygen to do that. So those were the different sort of strands of activity that took place over summer and autumn of 20 in order to be ready for January 21.
In terms of the lessons you learned from that work, your paragraph 204, thinking specifically now about oxygen, one of them is you say that something called the MGPS HTM needs updating. What's that, please?
That's the Medical Gas Pipeline System Healthcare Technology Memorandum, which is effectively the critical document which defines the do's and don'ts for oxygen systems in hospitals. It's it is the manual of how to specify and run a hospital oxygen system.
And why do you say it needs updating?
Because it's 20 years old. There have been significant technical advances over that period. And also, in particular, there is something within it called the diversity assumptions. And that's flow diversity. And this is a ratio which says how many of the endpoints in a hospital do you have to be able to support at any given time. And that influences the size and quality of pipework.
Right.
Now, the assumptions pre-pandemic are clearly not appropriate for a post-pandemic environment, and I believe they need to be revised.
That's very clear, thank you. Secondly, you make this observation: UK oxygen production will naturally decline over time.
Yes.
Why is that, and what do you say we should do?
So we were relatively lucky in the UK as a former steel producing country that used to make large amounts of steel. Steel consumes large amounts of oxygen in its production. So the UK was incredibly well endowed with air separation unit, the oxygen factories. And that was a significant boon to this pandemic. In the absence of there being a consistent demand for that oxygen, the UK industrial ability to produce oxygen will naturally decline as plants reach their end of life, and there is no economic rationale for people to replace them. So in 10, 20, 30 years' time, we will have significantly less oxygen capacity than we have today. The government has a variety of things it could do. It can either, take steps to incentivise the retention of that capacity, or seek to invest further upstream. If we had a steel industry in the UK, we would be in no danger of seeing a reduction in our oxygen capacity.
Thank you. Turning to a different topic again, please. Not much longer to go. I want to ask about work with the devolved administrations. You say the programme worked closely with the devolved administrations.
Very.
Some activities undertaken, like the procurement of additional ventilation capacity and the one we've been discussing, the boosting UK oxygen production, were done at a UK-wide level, so clearly took in the DAs as well, yes?
Yes.
You say that the strategic intent was to do as much together as practical and beneficial whilst respecting the devolution of authority.
Correct.
And you talk about a typical discussion with devolved administrations. What would that look like?
Typically, we would outline our plans to them, and they would decide whether they wanted to participate in those or not.
In any given part of the programme or as a whole?
Generally, in specific elements of the programme, we would say we're about to do this thing. We can either do it UK-wide or we can do it as England. What do you, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, think about that? And in some situations, all of them participated. In some, at times, there was often very good reason for Northern Ireland doing things quite differently, partly because of their connections to Southern Ireland and the way gas operations in particular work over there. But generally, people would be happy to work with us on elements and also do their own things as well.
One more question, having promised none, on allocation. You say that the devices we've been discussing procured by your programme on behalf of the UK were offered to the devolved administrations on what you call a crude but widely recognised per capita basis.
Yes.
And you say, given differing administration needs and equipment profiles, actual devices delivered would often change, delivering more of some items and less of others, whilst remaining broadly within the intent of that per capita distribution. Yes?
Agreed.
Question for you is this: as far as you were aware, did any officials or anybody else from any of the devolved administrations raise concerns with you about that allocation principle?
No.
I want to turn briefly then to some concluding points and lessons learned. One more bit from Professor Munisinger, if I may. INQ 000518349. This is her paragraph 187. This is her reflection overall. She says, I do not consider that there was a robust system in place to ensure an adequate supply of key healthcare equipment and supplies to the NHS during the initial phase of the pandemic. As far as those areas in which I was involved, specifically equipment, consumables, medicines and oxygen, the efforts made by DHSC, Cabinet Office and NHS England were remarkable and effective in many ways. However, because of a lack of availability of resources to meet the demand in the first wave, clinicians were required to use unfamiliar or less than ideal equipment, medicines and consumables, which will have augmented the pressure under which they were working. These factors combined posed a potential risk to patient safety and may have added additional psychological burden to staff who were working under conditions of unprecedented challenge. I wanted to focus on that very first sentence, the robustness of the system in place. What's your reflection on that, Mr. Sterling? Do you agree with Professor Munisinger?
I think it's very easy to say that we would have been in a stronger position if we'd have had more supplies of the items that we needed on the shelf ready. In terms of the ventilators and the consumables, I think the second point she makes about using items that they were unfamiliar or less than ideal, I think that's the key bit that I would focus on and take here. Because in many situations, it wasn't that we didn't have an item. We did have an item, but it wasn't necessarily the item that people were familiar with or would have considered their first choice. So I think practically, I think we would struggle to see what a system would look like that would guarantee clinicians their first choice item in a time of unprecedented demand and pandemic. So I certainly think it could have been more robust. There is certainly greater levels of preparedness and stocks that could be held in advance. And that would go some way to easing these pressures. I'm not sure whether it's realistic to have as an objective that everybody always gets their first choice item. I think that's whether that's an achievable objective, I'm not certain.
Your personal recommendations, first at paragraph 187, you talk about the requirement for a stronger national medical technology capability. So zooming out from ventilators, putting ourselves in the situation of a future pandemic which requires scaling up some piece of complex medical technology at pace. What do you mean by, it might be obvious, but a stronger national medical technology capability?
So if we compare medical technology to medicines, medicines has had for an extended period of time a core national team, both within the department and within NHS England, that have as their enduring remit making sure the country is in an appropriate place with medicines. Prior to the pandemic, no one had that remit for medical technology. And one of the things that I did in the later stages of my involvement with the department was create the Directorate of Medical Technology, which was aiming to provide a central point of leadership for that going forward. I think that has benefits both in a pandemic resilience environment and also more broadly supporting issues around choice, availability and innovation.
You say this, medical technology needs clear ownership. It's now too big and too impactful to patient outcomes not to have clear direction and leadership. Is that what you were seeking to address through this directorate?
Yes.
You're not there anymore, but was that work underway as you left?
Prior to my leaving, I acted as the interim director of medical technology for the department and also supported the department in recruiting a permanent successor who is still in post.
Very good. Another of your observations is this: interoperability of medical devices and technology should be mandated, your paragraph 203.
Yes.
Could you just tell us what you mean by that, please?
So a number of these devices, device manufacturers will often use bespoke connectors, bespoke plugs, slightly different formats and styles of doing things.
And is that where we can see some of those problems that the clinicians I've put to you are talking about?
Absolutely. And if you talk to suppliers, they will say that that is done in the name of patient safety. And there are very important patient safety benefits of making sure that you can't accidentally plug the wrong thing in. That doesn't necessarily mean that every supplier needs to have their own bespoke piece. And there are also obvious economic benefits to you as a supplier if your device only works with one connector and you have to therefore get all of your consumables back from that device. Now, certain suppliers have features which enable you to use their devices in interoperable modes. And my belief is that it should be a requirement for all future medical technology that if there is something that is bespoke or unique or prevented as part of normal operation, there is a way of turning that feature off in a pandemic environment where you may have to plug it in to something else. It's not particularly conceptually difficult, but what it does mean is you don't have to run completely different supply chains for breathing circuits. All of the filters are inoperable, the oxygen sensors, all of the little bits and pieces that actually make this work. You don't have to have 10 different types of each of those. And I also think that would make it a lot easier for clinicians. But again, it's a change that would need to be brought in a phased and measured manner.
Thank you. Finally, please, I want to put one of the author recommendations of Professor John Manners-Bell, who is our supply chains expert.
Right.
It's his author recommendation 17. I don't need to put it up on the screen. What Professor Manners-Bell says is this: if new healthcare equipment is required as part of a pandemic response, efforts should be focused on providing existing medical equipment manufacturers with the resources to scale up production, rather than encouraging designs from manufacturers with no relevant experience. Production under license should be a consideration. What's your take, your view on that, please, Mr. Sterling?
I understand where he's coming from. My experience of having been through the pandemic is that actually existing medical device manufacturers tended to be slower and more risk-averse in their willingness to try unusual and challenging things that need to be done, whereas suppliers from other industries are potentially more flexible and willing to operate on the basis of this is what I can do. We did have discussions with many medical device manufacturers about scaling up their capacity, and probably better taken up with Gareth and the Ventilation Challenge team.
We did do so, yeah.
But my experience was that non-healthcare suppliers were faster, more nimbler and agile at responding to our needs than existing medical suppliers. And I was surprised by that. So I can see where he's coming from, but that doesn't tie with my experience.
Thank you, Lady. Those are my questions. I think there
Thank
are
you. Some questions, first of all, from Ms Morris, who's just sitting there.
Thank you, my lady. Mrs Sterling, good afternoon. I represent the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK, and I have two topics, please, to ask you questions about. The first is on the topic of preparedness, and particularly in relation to consumables, not ventilators, not devices, but consumables. Okay. You say at paragraph 141 of your statement that when we entered into the pandemic, in a strong position at all levels. As you say, ward cupboards were well stocked, I think is the phrase. The concern in your statement was about being able to sustain that supply.
Yeah.
Should there be a protracted surge or further larger surges as part of the pandemic? Is that right?
That's correct.
So from that analysis, I anticipate you'd accept that stockpile of medicines available at the beginning of the pandemic was not modelled around the provision of a high or protracted surge demand in the event of a pandemic. It was well stocked, but couldn't face the surges that the pandemic inevitably brought.
I think I agree. Can I just check one thing? I can't comment on medicines.
Okay.
So I can absolutely respond on consumables, but in terms of the medicine stockpile, that's not something I was responsible for.
Okay. I'm going to ask you now about a report from the swine flu critical care group. So after the 2009 swine flu pandemic, the Department of Health had received feedback from clinicians within that group in which they expressed some concerns about the need to stockpile supplies of consumables and medicines in their example. This is a report that's been shared with you as part of the inquiry's disclosure to you. In that report, they said that in a pandemic of greater severity, sustained production, including that from outside the UK, and haulage would be in jeopardy. So they were sort of foreshadowing beyond 2009 that in a more severe pandemic, there'd be a problem with the sustained production of consumables and medicines. They said that a sustained surge of critical care capacity would be very difficult to maintain without the building up of stocks in local units. One of the items they mentioned in their report was propofol, an active sedative component of intravenous anaesthesia, so part of critical care provision. So my questions are this, please. Is it correct then that the Department of Health was well aware that there would be a lack of sustained production and supply of medicines and consumables during a pandemic, and this would predictably affect ICU medicines like propofol?
Okay, so my involvement in this started on the 3rd of March 20, and I was not involved in the pandemic preparedness activities prior to that date. So I appreciate that document was released as part of the evidence process. I had not seen that document prior to that, nor would I have expected to have done. In terms of the core point around sustained production of consumables, we import the vast majority of our consumables from overseas. Large quantities of that, in fact, the majority comes from the Far East. So it is, I think you are absolutely correct and fair to say that in a pandemic environment where global trade and travel is disrupted, and that supply of consumables is not able to be brought in on a consistent basis from other parts of the world, the UK would struggle to maintain ICU capacity.
Thank you. Is it correct, therefore, to say that the only really predictable way of ensuring that supply is maintained in a pandemic is through having adequate stocks, through adequate preparedness, having the cupboards well stocked from the outset?
I think stockpiling is always going to be part of the answer. I think increasingly, if we're looking for a longer term and more sustainable answer, on or near shore manufacturing opportunities, particularly in flexible production capabilities, potentially offers a more cost-effective and sustainable route of achieving that. Stockpiles are very effective, but they are incredibly expensive.
But they are part of the solution you'd accept?
I think it is difficult to see any credible solution where a degree of stockpiling is not part of that.
Thank you, that's helpful. My second topic is about the operational management of the NHS supply chain. In your statement, you recognise the NHS supply chain lacked the resources to respond to increased demand during the pandemic. That's your paragraphs 19 and 21. You said in evidence earlier on this morning that in the pandemic all the trusts turned to the NHS supply chain and said, give me X, and then they weren't expecting necessarily to deal with the scale of the response during the pandemic from the requests from those trusts. However, do you accept that the DHSC had not assessed the supply chain's readiness and capacity to cope in the event of a pandemic and that subsequent demand that it would entail?
Again, I'm sorry, but I can't really talk to the pre-pandemic preparedness point. I think to your, NHS supply chain was operating, I think, around 60-ish% of NHS capacity, again, higher on some lines, lower on other lines. In the COVID environment, we both had an increase in demand and also those remaining 40% of trusts seeking to source from NHS supply chain. So effectively there was a double increase for supply chain. And having previously been involved in the NHS supply chain future operating model planning process, that degree of change would normally be ascribed in years. And I think there is no doubt that NHS supply chain could have scaled or provided that service. The challenge was doing that from a standing start at very short notice.
Understood. Final question, please. We've heard from Professor Sanchez-Grael's about sort of the complex network of contracts and governance that was involved in the supply chain. Is it correct in your view that without sort of a clear picture by the DHSC about the governance and operational management of the supply chain, it made it more difficult to assess the need and sort of the impact of the demand in the pandemic?
So the supply chains associated with ventilator productions are typically incredibly complex. I think we tried to streamline our engagement with that supply chain by at various times taking decisions not to engage with intermediaries and try to engage directly with the factories producing the devices to attempt to shorten that. More data earlier would have been helpful. However, I think we need just to take a slight degree of caution around the availability of data because, there are hundreds of thousands of products in the use in the NHS, and we probably needed and used data for maybe 200 to 300 of those products. It would be very easy as a knee-jerk reaction to say we need the data for all of the products and create a very significant reporting burden and challenge. What we were able to do with the consumables was to introduce a system where we were able to add and remove products to the list that we got data for, as and when market conditions enabled us to do that. So capturing data when we needed it. And, I think that we just have to be careful not to have the knee-jerk, we need all of the data all of the time for everything, because otherwise we'll need another thousands of people just to manage sets of data that we're not actually going to use.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Morris. Mr Thomas. Mr Thomas is over there.
Good afternoon, Mr Sterling. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
I represent FEMHO, that's the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. And like Ms Morris, I have two topics that I would like to explore with you. Mr Sterling, given your role and given the disproportionate impact of the virus on ethnic minority communities, it's certainly important for those who I represent to explore how considerations of equality influence the procurement and distribution decisions. So with that in mind, my first question is this. In paragraph 17 of your statement, you outline the primary aims of the oxygen, ventilation, medical devices and clinical consumables, including ensuring resources were located, quote, in the right place, according to clinical need rather than strength of voice or procurement capability. Mr Sterling, how were these principles applied to ensure fair and equitable distribution of medical supplies, particularly to healthcare facilities in regions or communities with high concentrations of ethnic minority populations who might have been disproportionately affected by the virus in healthcare facilities serving high-risk ethnic minority communities. Can you help us with that, please?
Okay, so our allocation process, as described earlier, was focused on looking at the volume of critical care ventilated patients in any area at that time. We used that to support decisions around allocating ventilators for urgent clinical need. Between surges, the capacity building activities, we had an explicit objective to level up capacity. And by that, I mean increasing critical care capacity in those areas that had least capacity more than in those areas that already had higher levels of capacity. And so the intent through that was to reduce any discrepancies in capacity levels between regions. We also looked at that through the lens of specification of devices and discussed with clinicians what, if any, differences needed to be made to the specification to ensure that all parts of the population were served. And that included buying, the primary area of their feedback around that was that age and weight were considerations, and a number of devices were bought specifically to support the paediatric and neonatal markets.
Thank you. You mentioned age and weight were specifically considered. Just piggybacking on that last answer, was the race considered, ethnic minority, was that considered?
So we asked our clinicians to help us get the appropriate specifications, and we asked them what differences we needed to make to support the population. The only time that I'm aware that race became an active consideration was around pulse oximeter devices. But from your reaction, I think you're already aware of some of the situations and discussions around that.
We are. Let me ask you, my next question was, during these phases, were there any impact assessments conducted to evaluate how the distribution and accessibility of critical medical supplies affected ethnic minority healthcare workers and communities differently? So did you do any impact assessments?
So I don't believe we did any impact assessments of the distribution of these devices. No.
Okay. Let me move on. In paragraphs 27 to 30 of your statement, you describe significant challenges related to the use of ventilators that were unfamiliar to staff and had documentation primarily in Chinese. Question: how were decisions about the procurement and distribution of these devices assessed to ensure compliance with the public sector equality duty, particularly in ensuring that fair treatment and safety for all healthcare workers?
So we recognise that some of the instruction manuals and supporting documentation was in other languages. We arranged for translations of those to be produced. We didn't translate them per se. We produced what we called quick start guides in English. We did not provide any support to individuals that were not able to read English. I'm sorry, I might have misunderstood your question, but we didn't, for example, translate those documents into Welsh or other languages of any kind. We translated them into English.
Okay. Can I move on to my second and final topic, please? And this is looking forward, being future-looking. As we reflect on the pandemic's challenges and the lessons learned, particularly concerning supply chains, resilience, and resource allocation, it's imperative to consider how future policies can be designed to be more effectively to support ethnic minority healthcare workers to ensure equitable access during a crisis. So that leads me to this question. In paragraphs 201 to 204 of your statement, you discuss the lessons learned from the pandemic's challenges, particularly the need for a broader stockpile and improved manufacturing capabilities within the UK. Given these reflections, how do you propose future policies be adjusted to ensure more inclusive support for minority groups such as minority healthcare workers who might be disproportionately affected in such crises?
I think clearly if we have a stronger stockpile and more availability of first choice devices, to use the phrase from earlier, less individuals will be asked to use devices that they are not familiar with. And I think that will benefit all healthcare workers. In terms of the appropriateness of those devices, I think we were and would always want to be clinically led by what was appropriate to be procured. And so we were working from the guidance of Professor Munasinger, who you're seeing later, and others, as to what would be needed for the entirety of the healthcare worker population. So I think there is clearly things that we can do to make sure we are better prepared, and I think they will benefit all parts of the workforce.
Milady, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. Those were the questions that we had for you, Mr. Sterling. You've described your role in procurement during the pandemic in very calm, measured and fair terms. You haven't highlighted the pressure that you and your team were under. I'm sure it was severe and sustained. So thank you for all that you did during the pandemic, and thank you for the help that you've given to the inquiry. I think you must be the stenographer's dream witness, if I may say so.
I've tried not to go too fast.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I shall return at 10 to 2.